There comes a moment in life, quiet, unannounced, almost invisible, when you stop typing the message, when your fingers hover and then fall away. When silence begins, not as punishment, not as revenge, but as truth. In that silence, something shifts. A narcissist is not afraid of your anger, your tears, or your confrontation. They afraid of your absence because they survive on echoes, your reactions, your hope, your pain. But when you never reach out again, the room goes quiet, and for the first time, they are left alone with what they've been running from their entire life, themselves. Silence. As power begins the moment you stop trying to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. For a long time, silence is taught as weakness, something associated with fear, avoidance, or submission. But in emotionally manipulative dynamics, especially with a narcissistic personality, silence becomes the exact opposite. It is an act of self-respect. It is the decision to stop leaking your energy into a space that never intended to hold it safely. When you choose silence, you are not giving up your voice, you are reclaiming it. You are saying without explanation or drama that your peace matters more than proving your worth. Narcissists thrive on reaction. They feed on emotional responses, whether love, anger, or desperation, because attention confirms their sense of control and importance. Silence cuts off that supply. It removes you from the role they assigned you, the responder, the fixer, the one who always comes back to smooth things over. Silence also shifts the power dynamic internally. Instead of living in a constant state of anticipation, waiting for the next message, the next argument, the next emotional swing, you return to yourself. Your nervous system begins to calm. Your thoughts slow down. You stop rehearsing conversations that will never bring resolution. That inner stillness is not emptiness, it is strength consolidating itself. Choosing silence requires courage because it asks you to tolerate discomfort without rushing to soothe it through contact. It demands emotional maturity to walk away without closure and trust that clarity will come from distance, not dialogue. Over time, silence rebuilds self-trust. Each day you don't reach out, you prove to yourself that you can survive without validation from someone who once defined your emotional landscape. In that sense, silence is not passive. It is deeply intentional. It is a boundary drawn without explanation, a line that says, I choose dignity over chaos. And in that quiet choice, personal power is not lost, it is finally claimed. And once you step into that silence, something else becomes unmistakably clear. The narcissist was never self-sustaining. They were feeding. The second truth reveals itself quietly, but unmistakably. Their sense of self depends on attention, the way a flame depends on oxygen. Without it, they don't glow, they flicker. A narcissist does not generate emotional energy from within. They extract it. Every response you once gave, every explanation, every apology you didn't owe, every attempt to fix. What they broke was a source of fuel. It affirmed their relevance. It reassured them that they could still provoke emotion, still command space in your mind. That is why your silence feels so unsettling to them. It interrupts the supply line they assumed would always remain open. What's important to understand is that it was never about connection. It was about confirmation. Your attention told them they mattered, that they were powerful, that they existed in a meaningful way. When you stop reaching out, you remove that mirror. And without reflection, they struggle to recognize themselves. The confidence they projected begins to crack because it was never built on inner security. It was built on borrowed emotion. This is why they often react strongly to your absence, not because they miss you in the way healthy people miss one another, but because the silence exposes a vacuum. It forces them to sit with an uncomfortable truth without someone responding, reacting, or chasing. They feel oddly invisible. And invisibility is terrifying to someone whose identity depends on being seen, admired, or feared. Your silence, then, becomes more than a boundary. It becomes a disruption. It reveals the imbalance that was always there. While you learn to stand on your own emotional ground, they are left searching for another source to replace what they lost. That contrast is not cruel, it is clarifying. It shows you that what felt like love was often dependency, and what felt like connection was control. In recognizing this, you begin to detach not just physically, but emotionally. And that is where real freedom starts. And when that supply is suddenly gone, when the silence holds and does not bend, the next realization hits them like cold water, the shock of absence. This is where the dynamic truly shifts. Up until now, they believed your silence was temporary, a pause before your return. Narcissists are conditioned by patterns, and the pattern was always the same: distance, then pursuit, tension, then reconciliation. But when the cycle breaks, confusion sets in. Your absence creates a void they cannot immediately explain. There is no message to decode, no tone to analyze, no emotion to manipulate. The familiar push and pull collapses, and with it, their sense of control. For the first time, they are not directing the emotional weather. The room feels different, quieter, unresponsive, and that lack of response becomes deeply unsettling. What shocks them most is not just that you're gone, but that life continues without them at the center of it. They begin to realize they no longer occupy your thoughts, your reactions, your urgency. The role they played, so carefully constructed, suddenly feels unstable. They expected impact. They expected consequence. They expected you to feel the loss the way they once watched you feel everything. Instead, they are left with unanswered questions. Did you move on? Did you finally see through the illusion? Or worse, did you simply stop caring? That uncertainty is powerful. It forces them to confront something they avoid at all costs, a loss they cannot control or repair through charm, blame, or manipulation. Meanwhile, on your side of the silence, something quieter but stronger is happening. The absence that shocks them steadies you. Each day without contact confirms that the world does not collapse when you choose yourself. You are no longer reacting, you are recalibrating. And as the space between you grows, so does your clarity. The shock of your absence teaches an unspoken lesson. They learned that access to you was never guaranteed, and you learned that your presence was more valuable than you were ever led to believe. In that realization, the silence stops feeling empty. It becomes solid ground. As that ground settles beneath your feet, something unexpected begins to happen within the quiet itself. Healing starts, but not in a way that announces its arrival. There are no grand realizations at first, no dramatic breakthroughs. Healing is subtle. It slips in through ordinary moments: a morning where your chest feels lighter, an evening where your thoughts don't circle their name, a breath you take without bracing for impact. This is the part no one prepares you for. Real healing is quiet. It doesn't demand witnesses. It doesn't post updates or seek validation. It happens in the spaces where no one is watching, where your nervous system finally believes it is safe enough to rest. Silence comes the environment where your mind stops performing and starts recovering. When you were still, reaching out, even in pain, your body stayed on alert. Every interaction kept the wound open. But in absence, the constant emotional noise fades. You begin to hear yourself again. Your intuition, once drowned out by confusion and self-doubt, grows clearer. You start trusting your reactions instead of questioning them. That trust is the foundation of healing. From the outside, it may look like nothing is happening. To someone accustomed to chaos, your stillness might seem empty or cold, but inside, it is active. Old patterns loosen their grip. You stop replaying conversations that never led anywhere. You stop needing them to acknowledge the harm. The silence gives you permission to stop explaining and start understanding. This is also where the contrast sharpens. While your healing unfolds quietly, they remain restless. They look for noise to fill the void you left behind, because healing requires reflection, and reflection requires stillness, something they resist. The quiet that restores you unsettles them. And that's the quiet truth. Silence doesn't just create distance, it creates different outcomes. In the same absence, one person heals and the other spirals, not because one is stronger, but because one is willing to be honest in the quiet. As you allow healing to take root without announcement, you begin to realize that peace doesn't need permission, it just needs space. And as that peace begins to settle into your bones, another shift takes place, one that has nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with control. In the quiet, they lose the ability to shape the story. For so long, they held the pen. They defined what happened, why it happened, and who was to blame. Every conversation became a negotiation of reality. Every disagreement, a chance for them to revise the past. But silence removes the audience, and without an audience, the performance ends. When you stop reaching out, there is no longer anyone to convince, confuse, or correct. They can tell their version to others, but it lacks weight now because you are no longer present to react or defend yourself. The power they once had to pull you into circular explanations disappears. And that loss is deeply unsettling because control over the narrative was never about truth. It was about dominance. Your silence rewrites the story without words. It says, I no longer need to argue my reality into existence. That choice is profound. It frees you from the exhausting need to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. In stepping back, you allow the truth to stand on its own, unedited by manipulation. For them, this is a fracture. They relied on your emotional engagement to validate their version of events. Without it, doubts creep in. If you are no longer trying to explain yourself, what does that say about their certainty? If you are no longer defending your Sharak, what does that suggest about the lies they told themselves? Silence creates gaps they can't easily fill. Meanwhile, you begin to experience a different kind of clarity. The story no longer needs constant revisiting. You stop reopening old chapters. You understand now that closure doesn't come from agreement. It comes from acceptance. And acceptance grows in stillness. This is where your power quietly solidifies, not in proving, persuading, or exposing, but in releasing the need to participate. The narrative no longer lives between you. It lives within you, settled and whole. And once you no longer need to tell your side, you've already won something far greater than control, your freedom. With that freedom comes movement, not loud, not performative, but undeniable. While the story settles inside you and no longer needs defending, your life begins to expand in ways that feel almost unfamiliar at first. This is where growth quietly takes root. You start making choices without filtering them through someone else's reaction. You explore interests you once postponed. You feel yourself stretching into spaces that were always meant for you but never felt safe to occupy. And here's the contrast that becomes impossible to ignore. Your growth requires letting go, while theirs depends on staying the same. As you evolve, they remain anchored to old patterns. They replay the same dynamics, seek the same validation, repeat the same cycles with different faces. Growth asks for humor, accountability, and self-examination, qualities that threaten the fragile structure they've built. So while you are changing internally, learning new emotional languages, they are circling familiar ground, mistaking repetition for stability. Your silence accelerates this difference. Without you as a reference point, they have no benchmark to measure themselves against. They can't provoke your reactions to feel powerful. They can't rely on your forgiveness to reset the cycle. Meanwhile, every day of distance teaches you something new about yourself. You become more grounded, more discerning. You learn the difference between intensity and intimacy, between attachment and love. At times, you may wonder if your progress is visible, if it matters. But growth is not a performance. It's a recalibration. It shows up in how you respond or don't, in how quickly you recognize red flags, in how little chaos it takes to disrupt your peace now. For them, your growth is disorienting. They sense the shift even without access to you. It's the feeling of being left behind without being able to point to a single moment it happened. That's because growth doesn't announce itself. It compounds quietly. This divergence is not about superiority. It's about willingness. You chose the discomfort of change over the familiarity of pain. And in doing so, you stepped into a future they cannot follow, not because you closed the door, but because they refuse to walk forward. As that distance widens and your path continues forward, something subtle yet unavoidable happens on their side of the silence. With no access to you, no distractions from your reactions or your presence, they are left alone with their own reflection. And for someone who has spent a lifetime looking outward for validation, that stillness becomes confronting. Your absence turns into a mirror they didn't ask for and can't easily turn away from. Without you to absorb their projections, there is nowhere for the discomfort to go. The excuses lose their audience. The blame has fewer places to land. In the quiet, unanswered moments, questions begin to surface. Questions they have long avoided. Why didn't you come back? Why didn't the usual tactics work this time? What changed? And beneath those questions lies an even more unsettling one. Was the problem ever fully outside of them? Silence forces a kind of reflection that words never could. When conversations stop, there is no one left to argue with, no one to convince, no one to overpower emotionally. What remains is the self, unbuffered and unedited. For a narcissist, this can feel like standing in front of a mirror that shows not just strength or charm, but cracks, contradictions, and unmet needs they've carefully hidden. This doesn't mean they suddenly gain insight or accountability. Often, they resist it. They may distract themselves, seek new sources of attention, or rewrite the story internally. But the mirror has already been placed. Even if they look away, they know it's there. Your silence planted that awareness, whether they acknowledge it or not. On your side, that same silence feels different. It no longer feels heavy. It feels spacious. You are no longer carrying the emotional weight of someone else's unresolved inner world. You realize that you were never meant to be their mirror or their anchor. That role was never yours to fulfill. In stepping away, you allowed reflection to happen where it truly belongs. You stopped absorbing what wasn't yours, and in doing so, you chose self-respect over self-sacrifice, a choice that continues to echo quietly, long after the silence begins, and as that echo settles, another bond quietly begins to loosen, one that was never built on love alone, but on survival. This is where the trauma bond starts to break. Not with anger, not with confrontation, but with consistency, with the steady, unwavering choice to remain silent even when part of you still aches. Trauma bonds thrive on intensity, on highs and lows, on confusion that feels like chemistry and pain that masquerades as passion. The nervous system becomes addicted to the cycle. Tension, release, reconciliation. Each interaction reinforces the attachment even when it hurts. When you stop reaching out, you interrupt that cycle. And interruption is powerful. At first, the quiet can feel unbearable. Your body expects the familiar surge of emotion, the rush of relief that came with contact. Without it, there is restlessness, doubt, a temptation to break the silence just to soothe the discomfort. But this is not longing for them. It is withdrawal from a pattern that trained your body to associate chaos with connection. As the days pass without contact, the fog begins to lift. The emotional spikes soften. You start responding to life instead of bracing against it. What once felt like obsession slowly reveals itself as attachment to uncertainty. And in that clarity, you begin to separate who you are from what the bond demanded you be. For the narcissist, this shift is destabilizing. Trauma bonds keep them tethered to control. Your disengagement weakens that tether. They can no longer rely on emotional volatility to pull you back in. The absence removes leverage. Without access to your emotional reactions, the bond loses its grip. Breaking a trauma bond is not about forgetting, it's about reclaiming your nervous system. It's learning that peace can feel unfamiliar and still be safe. It's realizing that love does not require you to abandon yourself repeatedly. And slowly, something remarkable happens. The silence that once felt like loss begins to feel like relief. You are no longer tied to someone else's unpredictability. You are no longer living in anticipation of the next emotional wave. The bond loosens because you stopped feeding it. And in that quiet detachment, your mind clears, your body steadies, and your sense of self begins to return. As that sense of self begins to return, something deep shifts beneath the surface. It's no longer just about detachment or relief, it's about worth. In the absence of chaos, you start to recognize how much of yourself you had been giving away in small, invisible pieces. Your time, your empathy, your patience, your forgiveness. And now, in the quiet, you begin to gather those pieces back. Silence becomes the moment you stop negotiating your value. You no longer measure yourself by how needed you are, how much you can endure, or how well you can be understood by someone who never truly tried. Instead, you begin to feel your worth as something intrinsic, steady, unprovable, and no longer up for debate. This reclamation doesn't arrive with arrogance. It arrives with calm. You notice it in the way you hesitate less before setting boundaries, in the way you no longer feel compelled to explain your choices, in the way your standards rise without resentment. You're not trying to prove anything anymore. You're simply honoring what feels right. For the narcissist, this shift is palpable even from a distance. The dynamic relied on your self-doubt, on your willingness to overextend, to question yourself, to stay engaged even when it cost you. When you choose silence, you remove yourself from that role entirely. You are no longer available to be diminished in order to make someone else feel large. Your silence says, I matter, without ever needing to say it aloud. It communicates self-respect in a language that cannot be argued with or manipulated. And that message is final. What's powerful is that this reclaimed worth doesn't depend on their acknowledgement. In fact, it strengthens because it no longer seeks it. You stop waiting for recognition, remorse, or understanding. You understand yourself now. You believe yourself. And that belief changes how you move through the world. In choosing yourself consistently, you close a chapter that once defined you, not with bitterness, but with dignity. Silence becomes the space where self-worth is restored, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. And once you have that, you never truly lose yourself again. And as your self-worth solidifies, you begin to notice something that feels almost revolutionary. Freedom doesn't have to shout. It doesn't need to be dramatic or loud. It doesn't require a final confrontation, a public declaration, or a detailed explanation. Real freedom is quiet, and it doesn't ask for permission to exist. It simply shows up, steady and unbothered, like sunlight after a storm. When you stop reaching out, you aren't trying to punish them. You aren't trying to make them suffer. You're not seeking a reaction to prove you were right. You are simply choosing peace. And that choice is powerful because it is rooted in your own life, not in theirs. It is not dependent on their behavior, their apology, or their recognition. It is dependent on your willingness to live in integrity with yourself. This is the final truth that silence teaches. Closure does always come from a conversation. Sometimes it comes from walking away. Sometimes it comes from refusing to be a character in someone else's drama. Sometimes it comes from choosing your own emotional safety over the illusion of resolution. In the past, you may have believed that ending a relationship required a climax, a moment of catharsis, a dramatic goodbye. But real endings are often quiet. They happen when you stop responding to the things that once demanded your attention. They happen when you realize that your presence is not a tool to be used. They happen when you no longer feel responsible for someone else's emotional weather. And in that quiet, you find something you may not have felt in a long time: peace without explanation, a calm that doesn't need validation, a life that continues beautifully without their approval. The narcissist may never understand what your silence truly means. They may interpret it as indifference or weakness or even a temporary lapse. But you know the truth. Your silence is not a void. It is a boundary. It is a choice. It is a reclaiming of your life. And in that quiet, you finally become whole again. So here's the part where we often expect the loud finale, the dramatic ending, the big reveal, the moment where everything snaps into place. But the truth is, the most powerful endings aren't always loud. The most powerful endings are the ones that leave you feeling something deeper than excitement or anger. They leave you feeling seen, grounded, and ready. Because if you've been in the kind of relationship where your silence felt like surrender, you now know that silence can be the strongest kind of resistance. You've learned that you don't need to explain your absence to anyone who never respected your presence. You've learned that the moment you stop chasing someone who never wanted to be found is the moment you begin to chase yourself again. And that is the real message here. Not about punishing the narcissist, not about waiting for them to realize what they lost, but about what you discover when you finally stop reaching out. You discover your own voice, your own peace, your own worth. You discover that you are not a resource to be used, a character in someone else's story, or a mirror for their insecurity. You discover that you can live without the constant emotional storm. You discover that your life does not need their permission to be meaningful. You discover that your healing doesn't need an audience. So if you are watching this and you are still caught in the cycle, still waiting for a message, still hoping for a sign, know this: the most powerful thing you can do is choose yourself again and again in quiet ways that build strength. Because the silence you're afraid of is the silence that will save you. And when you finally step into it, you won't be walking away from them. You'll be walking toward the person you were always meant to be. And that, my friends, is the kind of ending that changes everything.